How did that happen? Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure how that happened. I've just done it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So that's so the third thing is to say that we have models of world order which compete. So we had the Soviet model that collapsed in 1989, 91, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and so on. But on the other side, we had a US-led model of world order. This is the political West, which is at the center of our discussions this morning. You can call it what you like, the collective West, the Atlantic power system. They like to call it, its defenders, the liberal international order, if I'm not sure there was ever such a thing. Others call it lately, the British loved, Theresa May in particular, loved to call it the rules-based order. Even though who made the rules, there was no order. It wasn't based on anything. And apart from, it wasn't based on the UN Charter, that's for sure, which is what was most disturbing. So, but I call it, and the Russians love to call it, the collective West. I call it the political West. Why? And this is absolutely core, because what I think we've all, certainly me, over the years, have failed to understand the enormity of this, of what happened after 1945 in this US-led political order, this model of you have the international system, then in the sphere of international politics, we have competing models of the good life, as Aristotle would put it, of how human community should be organized. You had the Soviet version, we had the US-led version. Now, this political West is of an unprecedented, so we haven't actually understood that we live in the time of this political West, collective West, as I call it, what you like, but that political West is now beginning to disintegrate. That's the thing. And what Bill is saying is the collapse of order is that while that political West order is disaggregating, dissolving, disintegrating, call it what you like, that doesn't mean to say that the charter system in which it is embedded is also collapsing. Of course, it's under challenge. But that's why I make this distinction, that we can stand in defense of the charter principles, the principles in the charter, which about human dignity, about all sorts of things. It's not just the UN Charter, it's all the successive body of international law built on its framework, the 1948 Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so much more in the 1970s, plans for a new international economic order, social rights. There's a whole stack. It's a system, plus, of course, the UN agencies. All of those still stand. And I think this is what the United Nations Association is all about in defense of those the charter system. That doesn't mean to say we have to defend that order within it, that political order led by the United States. And so to understand this political West, there's so many points I want to say, and this is at which point I become perhaps a little bit confused, well, just too much stuff to say. Let me just say a thing. This political West is a creature of the post-1945 order. And so therefore I distinguish it from other Wests. And in total, I'm going to suggest 4 Wests. We have the political West, which I shall talk more about in a minute. This lasted from 1945 to 2025, roughly, 80 years, as I mentioned earlier. But we have other Wests. Before that, we had the 500 years of the imperial West, or the colonial West. Some people call it the Columbian West since 1492 and the so-called discovery of the United States. But it's certainly the age of colonialism, the destruction of the Aztec, Aztec and Inca civilizations, the occupation of India, and of course the century of humiliation of China and so on. This also, at this moment in time, and certainly since Black Lives Matter and far before that, we are coming to terms with this 500 years of Western colonialism, imperialism, and its glories, its achievements, Renaissance and Enlightenment values, which I certainly think are embedded in the Charter itself. So again, it's not a repudiation, but we're questioning and examining that 500 years today, unprecedented, endless books on the British Empire and its achievements and failings and so on. The debate continues. But that's important debate, and it overlaps and interweaves with my discussion of this political West. But it should be distinguished. It's a separate discussion. The modality of the one is different from the other. The third West I'd identify is again, I'm not sure what to call it, but the historical West. Again, huge debates. And even today, if we talk about a Judeo-Christian West, of course, given what's going on in Palestine, the Middle East, and so on, people are saying this Judeo element, what are you talking about? And how Christian has it been? And or even Greco-Roman, of course, and even many studies show the importance of Persian, Babylonian, and other civilization in the creation of this historical West. Again, huge debates, vast amount of books on it. The best one, in my view, recently published, is George Varoufakis, not Varoufakis, but confusing name, but Varoufakis, and it's called The West, and it's an excellent book. And so that debate is another one. In other words, what we're talking about this morning is three, at least, sort of debate, but I'm focusing on just political West. But it's important, in my view, to distinguish it. Otherwise, we end up totally confused. And so I mentioned a fourth, and this is a fourth one which doesn't exist, but it's the one of our imagination. It's one in which the UN Charter is finally implemented and it finally works. And let's call it a better West. And that better West is where I would, giving away the secret at the end, we'll talk, how do we get to a better West? So I'm not, if we're challenging and questioning the Wests, the three Wests I've just mentioned, that doesn't mean to say we repudiate it. We build on it, in my view. We have evolution, and therefore this better West is a vision of that, which is embedded, as I say, in the principles of 1945 in the UN Charter. And there's nothing better waiting in the wings, to my knowledge. I mean, of course, there's all sorts of religious, there's all sorts of other ways of looking at the world, but they're not in contradiction to what I'm saying. So that is my third point, the many Wests, the four Wests. My fourth point will be, let's look at this political West, this beast, this post-1945 US-led world order. Many things we could say about it. The first one, I would say, it has two faces. Again, you might say, accuse me of Descartesian dualism. I'm a very great dualist. But there's two faces to it. On the one side, we have, I would argue, a Commonwealth face of this political West, this US-led Atlantic system, transatlanticism, and so on. This Commonwealth, this is the US-led achievement of delivery of all sorts of public goods since 1945. And this is where I would locate liberal internationalism. This is the World GATT and World Trade Organization, for good or ill, the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, and all of its elements, which, of course, all still in the World Bank, the proportion which China should have is vastly underestimated, or India, and so on. But this is liberal internationalism, and the Commonwealth. I mean, endlessly they talked about also the values, which was built, this political West was built on the Atlantic Charter when Churchill and Roosevelt met on the ship of Newfoundland in the middle, or just towards the beginning of the Second World War. And the Atlantic Charter, which then became into the founding principles of NATO in 1949, as a community, not just a defense community, but a community of values, of freedom and all sorts of other good things. So that is one side of it, which I think is too often in the critics of the US-led system of Atlanticism too easily jettisoned. And of course, this was a vision of hegemonic order, that we would actually have US-led, would deliver these public goods, which through this Commonwealth aspect of the political West. And in many ways, they were good goods and building on, at its best, building on what I would argue, indeed, the values of high modernity. This would be Enlightenment values, a sort of Kantian vision of, and Habermas, who just recently died, Jürgen Habermas, and so on. They build on endlessly praise for that Commonwealth aspect of the political West since 1945, delivering freedom, and a vision of also of universities, for example, which was a sphere of open and critical debate. And so Cardinal Newman was one of the best, who writes about the vision of what a university should be. Of course, now we've lost that amidst the sea of managerialism, red tape, student debt, and technocratic managerialism, and so on. Not entirely lost, but we're drowning in all of that. That's the Commonwealth side of this political West. The other side is this imperial West continued, which, of course, the building on this 500 years type West, this hegemonic US-dominated system. And it was also quite clear, the critiques, and there's an endless number of books published by Verso, Pluto, and so on and so forth, Clarity Press, were usually from the left, would argue that this whole US-led system has been an abomination from the start. And in many ways, the critique is valid. I mean, the Commonwealth side, bear that in mind. But on the other side, this other side, right from the start. And again, there's an endless slew of books now rethinking or discussing the Cold War. The best book is by Zubok, not Radchenko, who's dreadful, but Zubok, Vladislav Zubok, and many, many more. This Cold War, for example, the first Cold War, it was avoidable. It was clearly avoidable. It was at Yalta, Potsdam. It was quite clear that they took a decision, the great powers, that's United Kingdom, US, and the Soviet Union, that Germany would be neutral, it would be united, and it would be disarmed, a demilitarized Germany. Within a very short time after 1945, the US repudiated that in all sorts of ways, and of course went on to establish West Germany by 1949. And this, we now see the archives, and it's absolutely clear that this vision of a demilitarized, vast, neutral Germany in the center of Europe was, the Soviet Union was very serious about it. It wasn't just simply in Washington, as always, they say, oh, they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes, as they say usually with its interlocutors, they don't take into account what they're saying. Even Stalin in 1952 came back to this idea of a united Germany, which of course would have meant at that stage, fusion of, and of course the Soviet Union was very reluctant to establish East Germany, the GDR, very reluctant indeed, which upset these German communists, comrades, very much, we now know. Stalin in 1952 came back to this, and from the archives, it was a very serious plan. Nikita Khrushchev, after Stalin's death in 1953, also came back to this idea. And then finally, when they lost patience, West Germany joined NATO in 1955, and then, of course, it put up the Berlin Wall. And so all those celebrations about the end of the Berlin Wall in 1989, for me, always were rather hollow. We didn't need this wall. It was Khrushchev's utter frustration not to let them off in any way. You can critique as much as you like. But just historically, it was unnecessary. There were alternatives, and the West deliberately, cynically, or Washington foreclosed it. That's historic. I mean, there's enormous debate, the whole new literature emerging about this, which is fascinating, by the way. That's just one example of Cold War thinking. And this political West is deeply embedded in Cold War thinking, zero-sum thinking, not cooperative, not in the spirit, and this is why the Soviet Union and Russia today still talks about Yalta, Potsdam. And another point about the political West is that it was a way in which to establish, first of all, a combination of Commonwealth and empire in relationship between the United States and the Western European states. Of course, the Marshall Plan helped recreate it, but then again, in the foundation of NATO and then later on the European Union, what's now the European Union, enormous discussions about, for example, the European movement in 1949, 1950, looked as if it was become very independent. And we know Alan Dulles and the Dulles brothers at the CIA and State Department, absolutely, they actually kicked out the leadership at that time and put in a pro-American leadership. Again, that's one of those aspects in which European and this political West is a constant system of bloc management, bloc politics, us against them. And that's what the Cold War is all about. So then we could say much more about that. I'll just say that one element, well, moving on. So we have the political West and many other things. It's embedded logic of conflict, militarization, it became a defense community. Then, okay, the first Cold War ends in 1989. The Soviet Union says, look, we don't need this Cold War. Let's move beyond it. And it is Gorbachev is going back to the Yalta-Potsdam idea of this word, which I rather like nowadays, comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, comity, where powers, great powers and small, work together to solve common problems of humanity, comity. That was embedded in the Yalta-Potsdam Agreement, such like. All of that failed, but Gorbachev believed in it. Gorbachev he came to power in 1985 in the Soviet Union with a new political thinking. And it's astonishing. All of that new political thinking, it didn't come out from nowhere. It was actually coming back to what they thought that historical moment of historical openness after 1945. They wanted, this is what Gorbachev was thinking. In 1989, 91, end of the Cold War, we thought another moment of historical openness. Unfortunately, it did not happen that way. And instead of which, the political West radicalized. It believed it won the Cold War. It won a war that no one needed, which it itself inflated. Not to say the Soviet Union was perfect, certainly not. Absolutely not even. But nevertheless, it could have been avoided, as the documents, as Zubok shows quite clearly, and many others show, on the basis of what we now know. It was avoidable. So it was a hollow victory, but it was not a victory at all, because the Soviet Union and Russia, to this day, say it was a common sense. It was a victory of common sense. We all won. There's a stupid Cold War. Let's move beyond it. Instead of which, and this is why it's important, this political West has huge effect. What does it do? The political West changes the character of state formation in its member states. Now, there's a great literature on how membership of the European Union changes states from nation states, we know we're sovereign, take all the decisions and so on, to you have become a member state. Christopher Bickerton, my former colleague at the University of Kent, Phil Cunliffe, has got a book about it called, the book particularly is by Chris Bickerton in 2011, From Nation State to Member State. It changes the nature of the state. Of course it does. You become part of a larger supranational or other body. But what I think has been neglected is that membership of this political West has an equal effect. It means that the states part in NATO, in this political West, lose an element of sovereignty, that they lose the ability to decide strategic. And ultimately, it was Washington which, for 8 decades, dominated and drove politics in this political West. Of course, not for a second do I say, was it monolithic, homogeneous? It was not. We saw this in 1956 with the Suez Crisis, where Eisenhower pulled the plug on the Anglo-French Israeli attack on Suez. We saw it with de Gaulle, for example, in 1966, when de Gaulle kicked out NATO headquarters from France. We saw it over the huge battles over energy relationship between West Germany and the Soviet Union, the building of gas and oil pipelines in the 1970s and 80s onwards. The United States said no. One US ambassador says, what on earth has it got to do with Washington? Why Bonn, now, or Berlin, would build a gas pipeline for cheap, which was the foundation for Germany's success for the last 3 decades until the last 5 years, and so on. But in other words, it's this enormity of change. It also meant that the Western European states became what I argue were legacy great powers. After 1956, France maintained a degree of autonomy because it then said, never again will we be dependent on Washington, and it then became the major motor in establishing what is now the European Union. It found a role for itself. United Kingdom, by contrast, after 1956 and the humiliation of 1956, the Suez Crisis, it decided, never again will we be separate or challenge the United States. And indeed, we've been the most loyal ally. I remember my friend Thomas Graham in the White House at the time of the Iraq War said there were lots of opposition to the Iraq War in 2003 in the White House, surprisingly enough, in the Republicans. But he told me, when we were having these discussions, they would keep pointing to Tony Blair, who already from late 2002 said, we are with you whatever you do. In other words, they kept saying, look, the British are saying they've got weapons of mass destruction and so on. A devastating relationship. So weakened those anti-war elements or critiques of the war, not anti-war, within the White House. Anyway, so that was a catastrophic. And only now we're beginning to say, which was the last part of what was going to be the talk, which I haven't got to yet. Just to say very briefly, after 1989, the political West, instead of dissolving, it radicalized. And that's where we are today. Instead of dissolving, NATO has done its business, Soviet Union is gone. Why do we need to do it? And this is what I say, it's unique. Military alliances, after the Napoleonic Wars, after all the other wars, they end. It's over. The war's over. Let's have peace. and this is the theme of my book, the Lost Peace. Instead of building a new peace order, which would have meant a weakening of Atlanticism and building of genuine pan-European continentalism from Lisbon to Vladivostok, as Gorbachev put it, which is an agenda, in my view, still on an item still on the agenda, to build a genuine peace order on our continent. Washington decided otherwise. We lost sovereignty. We lost the Gaullists in France, and I'm one of the last Gaullists in England. And I think there may be a few in this room who actually argue for not for domestic politics, but in terms of this Europeanism of a Europe of nation states, a Europe together on functionalists. We come together for purposes of energy, for education, for human movement, all of that. It makes sense. But going beyond that is something else. But all of that, in one way or the other, was stymied, and it led to a very peculiar European unity, which is an impartial beast, and of course, it has huge consequences. In short, after 1989, instead of dissolving, it radicalized. It became more political West rather than less. I'm not going to go into all the details. I'll just give the headlines. It radicalized in at least 6 ways, and just give you an idea. I don't want to be tough on a Saturday morning, but in the Hegelian, from our good friend Wilhelm Hegel, and this is, of course, in Hegel's historicism. That history has got a zeitgeist, it's got a purpose and meaning, a teleological. We know it's going. And of course, Hegelian historicism, which where you got Fukuyama, end of history idea. We are the bee's knees. There's no alternative. This is the way history goes. As I said, this is, in other words, the political West claimed to be universal. Hang on, guys, I'd say, and I said, the only universal legislator is the Charter, United Nations. How can you then claim to be? That's a usurpation. So that Hegelian radicalization, immediately dangerous. Second radicalization was Kantian. It suddenly put human rights at the top. Now, of course, we're all in favor of the Charter. It's all about human rights, but it's about other things as well. It's about peace. It's about development. It's about other elements. We didn't need that. So human rights then became an instrument of Cold War rather than a genuine attempt. And again, hypocrisy was rampant. I mean, there's Samuel Moyne and others are marvelous on all of the way that human rights was instrumentalized. So you batter your opponents with it, but turn a blind eye to your friends. I mean, obviously, mass executions in Saudi Arabia over gender issues and so on. It's, that doesn't matter as long as they're our people. So that Kantian element was a very peculiar thing. The third one was Hobbesian, because it was, they never gave up militarism. Of course, troops, there was a certain peace dividend, but this militarism, this idea of the security state, it was never dismantled. In the United States, you had this emergence of a military-industrial ideological complex, vast machine of think tanks built on the Atlantic power system. I'm talking about Atlantic Council. If you look at its publications, they spew out vitriol non-stop and have done since their foundation. They are fighting a Cold War as if it had never ended. Of course, it hasn't ended because it's back, because of these guys. A vast, K Street in Washington, D.C., full of these think tanks, funded by our dear friend, the plutocrats, and of course, even mention IPAC, the Israeli one. But this is a vast machine, which the other West, the Commonwealth side, which is what you could call in the United States. Glennon has got a marvelous book, talks about the Trumanite state, that security state versus the Madisonian state. The Trumanite state is the huge security apparatus, the CIA, the FBI, all these think tanks, this vast machine, of course, the weapons defense companies and so on. They never demobilized. They kept looking for new enemies to keep the business going, keep them in business, and in our back, I'm afraid, in good business. And the Madisonian state, that is the Constitution, rule of law, rule of independent critical thinking and so on, was completely overshadowed. Yes, they have the elections in the United States, but if anybody really stands against it, even AOC, Alexandria Cortez, in her speech in Munich, the Democrats, almost quiet at the moment, given what's going on. So that's the Hobbesian side, this element. So Hobbesian side, then of course, again, a whole issue, there's a whole debate about the Hayekian one, which basically, we spent the first 40 years of this 80-year period building welfare states, building, as what would you say, embedding the market in elements of social control. And we've spent the last 40 years dismantling that, the neoliberal revolution, neoliberal globalization, and so on. So that's Hayekian. Then, of course, you have, I just said, Leo Strauss. I don't suppose many of you know him very well. Leo Strauss, an important American thinker. Basically, he has imbued our public sphere today with his spirit, which is basically that some people know what's what. This is what he would call exoteric knowledge. And esoteric is just what goes on outside. In other words, that Straussians, which dominate the neocons in the United States, do not take well to debate and criticism. They say, we know, and that's why the public sphere is in the West, political West, has been closed down. In the critics, of course, you have huge disinformation, anti-disinformation campaigns, which themselves are a form of disinformation, and so on. So the Straussian version is on steroids today. Anybody like me, I'm afraid, we're under endless pressure and so on. The dissidents, as we'd say. And just to say the final one, the Marcusian one, which is all about identity and so on. Bottom line, and I don't have time, but in the last 5 minutes, the key point, I would argue, but I had to get to where I want to be, is that finally, after 80 years, this is dissolving. And let me just say that in brief, well, 2 points I wanted to say. How is it being dismantled? So I don't know what number point we're at today, but the next one is that Donald J. Trump is engaged in 5 defections, defecting from the world order that the United States created. That's why he's, obviously quite apart from his malignant narcissism, in political terms, what's he doing? He's dismantling the Atlantic Alliance. We've seen this over the last few weeks. Why didn't NATO help us when he says we don't need any help from NATO? And for the first time, and of course he says we don't need NATO. Again, many people supported MAGA, Make America Great, and America Firsters, supported Trump earlier because, quite apart from his protestations of being a peace president, he actually says, why do we need NATO? And it's a question many of us have asked for 30 years. I've been arguing, as you know, that NATO exists today to deal with the consequences of its existence. It provokes wars, and then it justifies itself. So look, we need NATO because we've got a war. But we've got a war because NATO was enlarging to the borders of Moscow, basically. And we're going to put Tomahawk missiles 400 kilometers from Moscow. Just unbelievable stuff. So this is dismantling that. The second defection isn't, okay, you could say he's defecting from the political West. The United States created it, is now defecting, and America first. We no longer have liberal globalism. We just simply have power politics. The second defection is perhaps less welcome, and that is a defection from the charter system itself, from the United Nations. The United States is not paying its dues. Earlier this year, it left 66 international organizations. Half of them were UN agencies and so on. So a huge defection. Again, I haven't got time to go into detail. The third defection is internal defection from US constitutional norms, principles, and democracy. The fourth defection is slightly different, but it's dismantling the administrative state. This is the New Deal, the one built by Roosevelt in the 1930s and went on, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and so on. So it's dismantling its welfare state. And indeed, the fifth defection is from the liberal economic order. So that's the defections. And my final point is that where does that leave Europe? So I've got to where I should have got. So, but it doesn't make sense. Europe today is facing huge challenges. I'm talking about Europe, not just the European Union, but European Union itself is changing dramatically. NATO is quite clearly under unprecedented challenge, and many people are now saying we need. If the United States, it won't leave NATO as such. It's very hard. There are mechanisms. It has to go through Congress. But what does Europe do today? Its lack of strategic thinking is shocking, because 80 years of embedding in this political West has left it like headless chickens. It doesn't have a clue. Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, has, in the last 5 years, has undertaken a stealthy, creeping coup. That's the word they use in Brussels, in the European Commission to seize powers which do not belong to the Commission. And she's used the Ukraine war, and obviously people always use war to increase their power. And what she's doing is quite illegal. It's all sorts of things, but it hasn't been challenged. But what is happening, the European Union is changing from a welfare project to a warfare project. Again, I've just been talking to some British official a couple of days ago, and we're saying the major fear in the FCDO now is that the European Union will try to project itself as the new NATO, a militarized new NATO, which, of course, for many years with the European Union has been moving in this direction, remilitarization, and even after the Draghi Commission on Competitiveness, the vision that you can militarize your way out of deindustrialization is a crazy. That's the only answer. And of course, it's exactly the same answer that our cakists, the Boris Johnson's continuation legacy government today, believe that the Strategic Defence Review of last year, which basically says, let's militarize, let's build up the armed forces. Well, I'm a great believer in defence. As a patriot, of course, we all are. Security development is the core task of any government, and I certainly don't repudiate that. But you have to be intelligent about the way you do it. You don't. Well, there's all sorts of debates, but the Strategic Defence Review did not answer fundamental questions, or the basic strategic question is, what do we do about Russia? What Ursula von der Leyen, Kallas, and this commission at the moment are pathological Russophobes. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Pathological. It is pathological. You listen to the speeches of Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas. They say, God, is this Goebbels or what? The hatred for Russia is so intense. Whereas you have other voices in the European Union, Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, less, but she said it. We need to talk to Russia. You'd have thought, even in the First World War, by 1916, there were, Germany put forward discussions about peace. It's astonishing. It is almost unprecedented in history for 4 years of this Russo-Ukrainian war that the European leaders, the Commission, has not once talked about talks as a Commission. Individual leaders have. Orban, of course, whose election in Hungary tomorrow is important. He's talked about it. The Slovak leader, Robert Fico, I mentioned it in my book. He comes away from a European Council meeting and said he was shocked at the language. That even any mention of peace talks was shouted down like a villain. This is the strategic irresponsibility after 80 years of lack. Western Europe has not been responsible for its own security strategy and development, and it's got no way of thinking. All it can think about is going back to Cold War and fighting Russia again, a nuclear power, and so on, and we'll fight to the last Ukrainian. This is the debate where I wanted to go, and I think we need to discuss, where does Europe go today? What is UK's part in all of that? It isn't just simply leaving the European Union and then going back as part of a defence community, which continues the Cold War as if 1989 never happened, and let's keep going until we militarize our way out. It's a complete dead end. And as you know, investments in military stuff is important, and obviously we need a defence industry. But buck for buck, pound for pound, it doesn't have the multiplier effect, which a building in a high-speed railway, other infrastructure development has. In other words, the huge challenge now is, what does Europe do after the end of the political West, after the end of this Atlantic West, after the end of the United States full debate? We've seen the debates at Munich Security Conference, Davos, and so on. And that's where maybe I'll leave and stop at that point, because that is the challenge of our times. After 80 years, we're entering into, in my view, a moment of, it's obviously very disturbing, but at the same time, a moment of historical opportunity. And that's why it's so good to have a meeting of this sort, in which we can actually say, well, okay, how do we build this better West? How do we move beyond it? Not just look backwards and repeat the mistakes of the past, but let's move beyond Cold War thinking. How do we get on with China, with India, with the huge development and enormous challenges and excitement? I've just been to Tanzania, which has a population, over 50% of its population is under the age of 16. That's going to be huge, amazing. It's very dynamic, lovely country, but with huge challenges. Those are the sort of issues that the West, this better West, needs to address. Thank you.
There's one Q&A, and just one confirmed. So,
very good to let me ask a question first. Clearly a wonderful talk across amazing regions. I've got one very specific one. How we go with Suhan, we're trying to write a little document on how we to stop war, not the bigger issues that we've been dealing with, but stopping war. Key point, and I'd love your view on this, is Ukrainian war. You know, I come 1945, I come from a Churchill view and stopping evil people and stopping, you know, if you don't fight now, you won't. That's kind of a standard Western view. I'd love your view of could we have avoided Ukrainian war?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the question is, could we have avoided the Russo-Ukrainian war? And the answer is yes, absolutely. This was the most avoidable war in history. Yep. And so not only do I say yes, but I say a supercharged yes. 5 words would have done it. Ukraine will not join NATO. That's all it would have taken. And that's all that Russia wanted. This is what was at the heart of the 2021 security documents, which no one talks about now, but it was absolutely crucial. And indeed, Dmitry Medvedev, way back in 2008, put forward this idea of a new European security treaty. In other words, we squandered the peace order after 1989, the last peace, that we went for Atlanticism and NATO enlargement. Okay, you say the East European states wanted to join it. Of course they did. If that was the only thing on offer, well, I would have joined it. But what we failed to do, Russia then says, Putin says, we want to join NATO as well. Do you remember he actually said that just on the beginning of this war? And George Robertson and Bill Clinton in his last days said, you must be joking. And of course, Russia couldn't join the political West. This is why this concept, the political West, is important. Because Russia wanted to join Europe. And of course, Russia is a European state. I mean, it's all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok, by the way. It's all Russian. I mean, all Europeans and European culture and, you know, deeply embedded. But the political West is a different beast. It couldn't join. And Washington basically vetoed it. And that's why we've got this war. Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon in 2022. But Ukraine would not be in NATO, but NATO was fully in Ukraine. And of course, Joe Biden effectively provoked Russia. He did it on purpose. In September, Zelensky went to Washington, and then in November, they signed a security treaty between Washington and Kiev. Unbelievable stuff. I mean, you watch this in slow motion, and you could see, you know, it was as if they were goading it. But the key question was, can I just go back one step and say, yes, there's 4 ways to examine the Russia-Ukrainian war. The usual way, the way which dominates in the Daily Mail. In fact, a few weeks ago, I was asked to do an article in which I challenged the basic standard view in the Daily Mail. And then it went all the way up and it was spiked by the editor. They couldn't allow a changed voice. Basically, the standard view in the West, Russian imperialism, it's essential, it's in their genes, expansionism, they're out for it. There's absolutely not a shred of evidence that this was the cause of this war, but it's the one that Ukraine's and its supporters put. So the imperial view, expand. The second view is domestic political view that Ukraine was a thriving, buoyant democracy. And of course, it was far more democratic than Russia, but it was very flawed. And Russia feared to see a successful Ukrainian democracy. It had to squash it. That's not, there's no evidence. I mean, it's a view, the second view. The third view would be this, I mean, my view is it's the security view. It was about security. And of course, then you could say, you know, the civilizational view that Russia, backward barbarism, that Ukraine is, as it were, the bastion of Western civilization, which then ties into this second West, which Ukrainians play all the time. And so on. So, yeah, in short, yes, it was avoidable. Then, of course, you'd ask, how do we get out of it? But we get out of it by understanding how we got into it. And so if you understand it's about security, let's build an inclusive security order, which the numbskulls in London and Brussels still haven't quite grasped. They will, because the West will lose the war in Ukraine. There may be tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more dead. But obviously, how can you win against a nuclear power? There's never been a war. This is three wars in one. There's the internal civil war within Ukraine. There is the interstate war between Russia and Ukraine. And there's the third war, the proxy war, the West versus Russia. And if we understand these analytical things, then you could try to deal with each one and try to get to a package. Thanks.
Is likely to provide good opportunities.
Thank you. I touched on that, but I'm very glad you raised it. Yeah, Brexit is, we should look at, in my view, look at Brexit as a, much bigger than its usual framework. My view on Brexit is again dualism. I'm sorry, but the second side of it is that on the one side, over 50, well, at the time, over 50% of UK trade was with with a continent and so on. And we, at the University of Kent, for example, 50% of my students in my Department of Politics were, well, continental, but mostly French. We had a B-Diplôme program with University Institut Politique in Lille because of Eurostar coming from Ashford, when it used to stop there, and we would go to Lille, and it was just, quicker than going to London, and so on. So these functionalist links were important, and one way or another, these functionalist links should be re-established. On the other side, the geopolitical side of the European Union was a catastrophe in the making for many, many years. So there's two sides to Brexit. The functionalist links, not just military, but need to be re-established. But that could be done in a new European Union. But the geopolitical European Union has been a disaster. This is why when you have Hungary or other countries saying, look, and even within Germany, they so-called populists who are questioning this war and saying, no, we need good relations with Russia. Why not? It's a major state. I mean, just to say, within Russia, there's plenty of people who want to re-establish relations with Europe. So Brexit is, in short, a huge moment of opportunity. There's no way back to the old European Union, no way back. Even though Starmer and this government is the lack of its political imagination is shocking. It is unbelievable. There's absolutely no serious strategic thinking. In fact, it's incredible. I mean, we may not like Mrs. Thatcher and her government, but her ministers were all thoughtful. She herself was an outstanding leader in all sorts of ways, strategically thinking. I mean, I don't support many of her policies, but just simply as an equality of leadership, purely leadership. She read the brief, she understood issues far more than this government. So Brexit is a moment of opportunity, but we need to get rid of illusions. There is no way of rebuilding an Anglosphere. That was a myth. Second, global Britain is only repeating the bombast. This is why I mentioned Cakers and Boris Johnson's having your cake and eating it. We need some fundamental strategic choices. Who are we as British people? And I mean, including Northern Ireland. Where do we go? Where do we fit in the world? And we need some serious thinking, and it hasn't happened. But again, this sort of place. But Brexit is done. It's over. We move on. But we rebuild functionalist relations with a new European Union, not this one. This one is a war project now, and that's not what we want. The Starmers love it, of course, but it's not the European Union we wanted. But we have to rebuild ties and friendships and student links and everything with our continental neighbors. Absolutely. All the way to Vladivostok, by the way, all the way. It has to be a European. Francois Mitterrand used to talk of a confederation of Europe. That's the sort of Europe I want. A confederation from, well, let's say from Dublin to Vladivostok.
Thank you very much for a very wide overview. Which puts so many things into perspective. But I would like to ask you, because you haven't actually dealt very much with it, how does this relate to the views of populations at a local scale? For example, the European Union debacle here with Brexit was driven by particular views of very local nationalistic and type, and these are continuing. In the United States, it has always been the case that there's been a very strong element of very aggressive nationalism, and these have driven the politics much more as the international rule of law type approach has decreased, which you've described. So how does one deal with this question of influencing, encouraging the population to look at the sort of model that you seem to have of a much wider international rule-based order?
Yeah.
Well, in the,
Okay. So that's a fundamental question. That the fundamental principle of the United Nations, the Charter system, is sovereign internationalism, sovereign states coming together for multilateral purposes to solve common goods. The political West has been pushing this alternative, liberal globalism, which basically hollowed out our societies and industry in all sorts of ways. You know, globalization is as much an ideology as it is a technical development. Of course, we have communications, computers, and so on. Communications have developed. But globalization after 1989 was a political project in all sorts of ways. And it did have huge detrimental effects for, if you like, for political communities, nation states. Populism is one of the idioms in which there are protests against that. So Brexit was reflecting genuine popular concerns. And to denigrate that, simply to dismiss those concerns, I think is unfair and wrong, though we may not quite like the way some of these concerns are couched in terms of immigration, in terms of, or anti-immigration and so on. But nevertheless, we need to go back to a position of genuine sovereign internationalism. But the popular views, it's, as I said, one of the Strauss, why I mentioned Strauss, is because that thinking dominates in the UK, for example. It's hermetic. Ideas coming from outside are closed out. As I said, we prepared, spent weeks trying to do this little piece in the Daily Mail. And in fact, it's obviously in the Daily Mail, even the Daily Mail, there were people who wanted to have different views out there, but it went all the way to the editor, and we'd spent a lot of time. It was all set, all you had to do. They said, it'll be published tomorrow. It went to the editor, whose name I've forgotten, and he spiked it. So where do popular views, who is shaping discourse? And this is where communications becomes important. The popular media, The Guardian, of course, is a fully fledged, paid up, liberal globalist paper, because they purged, by the way, after 2014, the Guardian sacked all the independent journalists. It became very much, as I said, years after the end of the Cold War, it then became decided we have to refight the Cold War again. This is one of the challenges of our time. And then you have the alt media. I'm not on social media, but where you have Substack, which is vast amount of media. How do you shape public opinion? But my key point is we should not denigrate popular views. And where the so-called populism, it takes many ugly forms. And so I distinguish between what you say, ethno-nationalism, or all nationalism is ethno in some ways, versus healthy patriotism. And I would go for patriotism. And I think that this cheap nationalism, which of course Starmer loved when we put out the flags and so on, British people don't put out flags. We don't need to, because if you're confident about your own patriotism and about your own nation, you don't need, like the United States, a young nation which needs to have a flag on everything. We don't in the United Kingdom. But when we do, it's a sign we've lost confidence in ourselves. So we need to be confident within the Charter principles.
well, in a way, I'm almost asking the same question as David here, because I mean, I very much welcome your analysis of the Russia and Ukraine, which to me makes an awful lot of sense. But I see no evidence that in, shall we say, in inverted commas, the establishment has any sympathy whatsoever with that. You know, as you say, it from the Daily Mail to the Guardian, the view is that Russia is an evil entity and Putin is a maniac, and that, you know, all we can do is increase our defence spending. Last spring, we went to the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference, and in his winding up speech, Ed Davey gave a speech which I could only describe as rabble-rousing against Russia. In fact, I wrote to him afterwards. I was quite shocked, to be honest. You know, this was a total attack on our liberal values, and we must rise up against it. So I see no evidence of any sensible arguments against these views in you know, British society. So where is this sensible, more enlightened view to come from?
No, that's a fantastic question, because I wish I knew. It's I heard, I picked up on that speech of Ed Davey and so on. It's shocking. It goes all the way across the whole spectrum. Nigel Farage, just before the July 2024 election, just a little peep, he said, well, you know, we need to examine why Russia went into this war. He was howled down. That is the Straussian view. It just closes all debate, and anybody who puts forward an alternative view. This is worse than the First Cold War. In the First Cold War, we'd call it McCarthyism. But of course, it's rampant. And any alternative viewpoint, if you or somebody else was going to put up your hand, you then get abuse, a useful idiot, your Kremlin talking points. The danger is, and I've said this publicly, and I'll say it again now, even though at the risk of excoriation, is that we're seeing the Ukrainization of Western European politics. It's equivalent of the Israelification of US politics. Israel's, of course, not going into detail, but just simply say the way that it's influencing the public sphere and the debate within the United States until recently. And Ukrainization it's got this visceral Russophobia, which was sponsored after 1989. I'm working on this elsewhere. Is that the 1989 revolutions were hollow revolutions. These were democratic revolutions without democracy. And anybody who stands against it, then it opens the door to what I call democratism. You go through the motions of democracy, you go through the motions of debate, as long as no one strays too far out from the consensus, no one challenges the consensus, or no one even votes against the mainstream. And anybody which does gets hammered. Farage has been very silent, and he's now as much of a warmonger as anybody else since he was howled down after that. So it's frightening. This is worse than in the First Cold War. The political atmosphere in the West, the political West, is worse than in the First Cold War. Many people believed that Donald J. Trump would be able to smash that open. We now see, of course, that was, he asked some of the right questions earlier, of course, giving monstrously wrong answers ever since. So, no, it's a question which, you know, we all, just to give another example, that after the Skripal case, which is still very mysterious and so on, of March 2018, Jeremy Corbyn, who argued, well, let's establish the facts, which seems to be a sensible, good old-fashioned, because I'm a great believer in high modernity. That's what we used to do, have open debate, facts, and so on. That doesn't happen anymore. That he was howled down, if you remember. Theresa May won against a succession of endlessly worse prime ministers. She said, you know, how dare you ask for facts? We know everything. As with Russia, can I just say that this doesn't mean to say we let Russia off the hook. No, Russia has moved into an authoritarian direction. That just recently, and for me, who worked very closely with the Memorial human rights body for many, many years, and I'm appalled and shocked and disgusted by its final closure by the court just a few days ago. This doesn't mean to say you have to, and I don't, justify the internal developments within Russia, but you respect that ultimately Russia, like Iran, has to deal with its own issues in its own time, in its own way. And it's not for us to do it. We can support genuine movements and to do it, but in a way which respects sovereignty and non-interference and so on. So to say that Russia has legitimate security interests is one thing. To give it a free pass on domestic development is another, and it is for all the other states. So, but it's all mixed together in this sort of extraordinary, and that's why the notion of a political West is useful, I think, because it actually shows this is the mechanism whereby it happens, described by Noam Chomsky, manufactured consent, and the whole debate on all of that. Thanks.
What we seem to be mainly talking about Russia, bipolar relationship with Russia, but it seems to me the world is moving in a more of a multipolar direction nowadays, and into regional blocks. And I wonder whether you might comment on that evolution, if that's what is happening, and whether you welcome that.
Yeah, multipolarity. Thank you. It's I do very much believe that, but we need to understand what we mean by multipolarity. On the one side, there is normative multipolarity. That is, the 193 members of the United Nations today are each in their own way a little pole. That they're sovereign, that they are now the post-Cold War, post-colonial situations has matured. For example, today we see how Pakistan is acting as a major interlocutor in international politics. It's to be welcomed. So it's normative that these are now 193 free and equal states. And of course, we should develop that more. United Nations General Assemblies where they speak together. Of course, multipolarity in the US international relations literature is all about blocks. But yes, against this political West, there is an emergence there's of course the global South. I mentioned Tanzania, but South Africa and Brazil are all acting, Pakistan and so on. India, of course, in its own way. So, and the list goes on. But at the same time, there is the beginning of an emergence of, let's call it a political East, Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, the BRICS Plus countries, which are really, and you mentioned blocks, the whole point of these bodies is they're not, if you like, counter-hegemonic, that is, simply against the Western's dominance. They're anti-hegemonic. To say the whole game of bloc politics is a mistake, and that is embedded deeply in Chinese political philosophy. It's India's view of international politics, and even Russia. They do not want to build this bloc, B-L-O-C, blocks like the political West, like NATO, the US-led political West, which is all about bloc politics, which undermines the very principle of the United Nations and the sovereignty of it. So, yes, thank you for widening our horizon. But the BRICS, of course, Iran is a member. And people may say, look, it's just a talking shop. But yes, it is. And so is ASEAN, the East Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For a long time, they talked about the spirit of ASEAN. And I respect that enormously. A year ago, Laos was the chair in office, the country in office. And I remember speaking to the Laotian delegation about ASEAN. And they were, it's marvelous, this spirit of cooperation, this spirit of mutual understanding within the Charter, explicitly within the Charter. That's where we need to go. So you're absolutely right. It is the political West which spreads its I'm going to say it's dangerous thinking across the world, which China's in its diplomatic initiative, the recent one, the Global Governance Initiative, and the other three before that, explicitly talks about commitment to the Charter. Can I just say that in this thing, that it's the West which has become a revisionist power, in other words, trying to throw out the old system, whereas these countries, China and Russia, technically are neo-revisionist. They support the Charter, therefore they're conservative status quo, but they're revisionist in a sense at the level of international, at a systemic level, conservative, at the international politics level, challenging that Western model of world order, which spreads division, hatred, violence, war across the world from their perspective. And therefore, they just don't want to do the same, but from the opposite end. They want to challenge a foundation of Cold War thinking, which is so deeply embedded in the political West. So thank you.
A really challenging talk. I'm afraid I'm going to be a devil's advocate in this room of idealists or whatever. I had a very influential stepfather who was conscious of going over the Second World War and then degree in sociology at Yale. But I mean, he definitely gave me a foundational political belief that Britain should not be in NATO back in the 1960s. So this kind of idealistic view, it was the era where we were realising about the Cambridge spies, we realised that, the British intellectual establishment was still really pro-communist as being Marxist, do we put it that way? And there were consequences of that gradually with the Hungarian uprising, Lech Wałęsa, the various uprisings were crushed by the Soviet Union. Gradually, the Marxists ceased to hold this idealistic sway over British intellectuals. So I'm asking myself, although what you say makes a kind of idealistic sense, that what is it conceivable that Russia would not just be satisfied with winning the war in Ukraine, but that it would proceed to the Baltic republics and that it would continue the tactics that Putin has shown of preparing just to intimidate, to strong-arm civilians, as happened in Georgia, so that any neighbouring country like Poland or wherever would just feel continual pressure from this mighty next door neighbour. And that one has to bear in mind kind of where appeasement through history has led us, of saying, oh, we'll just be nice to this. I mean, Russia is an empire already, in terms of countries which it assumes that it has to control and which it's seeking to extend. Is it really quite dangerous in view of, you think of the transatlantic cables, the various pressures which Russia continues to put on other people in the world that don't play along with it? Is it possible to move towards peace without having a sufficient military deterrent to say, we'd like to be friends with you, but we will not let you extend your empire? Mr. Putin, one of the elderly world male leaders that seem unable to stop having wars to justify their continuance in power, along with Netanyahu and others.
No, that's an absolutely legitimate question, and I think an important one. So thank you for that. I mean, two things. You mentioned you didn't, in the list of things, Hungary, you missed out for me, one of the most important, which was the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, putting an end to socialism with a human face, which in my view was one of the great self-defeat, self-invasions, because when Gorbachev came to power 20 years later, he wanted precisely that, socialism with a human face, but the Soviet forces with allies had defeated it 20 years too early, and he came 20 years too late. That's a side issue. But as for the other one, no, thank you very much for that question, because it's a fundamental one. Of course, as I said, defense is important. It's one of the fundamental functions of any government is to maintain security of its own people. That's absolutely right. And of course, development and welfare and other issues. Then the question becomes how to do it. And that's where I go along to say that these analogies of appeasement and so on, and for some people, it's always 1938, it's always Munich, and it's always Putin is the Hitler of our days and so on. Now, I've gone to, Soviet Union and Russia many, many times, and that's why I continue going, to precisely be able to help answer your fundamental, important, and good question. And, for example, last June, I was in Moscow at what's called Primakovskaya Chechnya, which is a conference organized by IMEMO, the Institute of International Economics and International Affairs. And that IMEMO institution, way back from the 1950s, developed the ideas which became the new political thinking. And, even though I'm much attacked for going to Russia, I believe in dialogue, I believe in diplomacy, I believe in engagement. But going there, it was absolutely fascinating because in the couloirs, in the corridors, and so on, over and over again, these senior figures, politicians, academics, commentators, and others, obviously now in wartime, you have to be careful, were talking to me. And they were saying, it's quite clear that within Russia today, and I know there is not a spirit of warmongering, it's actually extraordinarily lack of it, actually. And in fact, this war in Ukraine is being fought, it's described as a special military operation to try to deal with a security challenge, above all the Tomahawk missiles. And I could talk 20 minutes about that, because the last call of Biden and Putin before the war in December 2021 was precisely all about these Tomahawk missiles. Were they going to pop them into Ukraine? And then Biden in his dotage said, no. 2 weeks later, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, met Blinken, the US Secretary of State. And Blinken then repudiated it, says, no, we will put Tomahawks into Ukraine, but the only discussion we'll have is how many. Sergei Lavrov walked out. So if you are sitting in Moscow, you've been invaded by the Mongols, invaded by the Swedes, invaded by the Poles, invaded by the French, invaded by the Germans twice, etc., etc. What do you do with no defensible borders? Does Russia have legitimate security interest? You mentioned Georgia. The whole first half of 2008, Dmitry Medvedev, the liberal, tried to avoid that. And kept warning. We kept warning. You guys, you can't allow this. But the crazy guy, Mikhail Saakashvili, as you know, on the 7th of August, decided to attack South Ossetia. And they bombarded Tsikhin Valley, the capital of South Ossetia, indiscriminately, by the way. And then the Russian forces, the 58th Army, was ready, because they're not stupid. They were watching what was going on. And even Mark Champion, a virulent anti-Russianist who used to work for the New York Herald at that point and such like, told me at the time, he was a correspondent on the ground, and he saw the Georgian forces gathering on the borders of South Ossetia. And then they invaded on the 7th evening of the 7th, and the 58th Army came through the tunnel and repudiated and fought them back from South Ossetia. And of course, they then went into Abkhazia. So, and later on, the Tagliani Commission looked into the Georgian war, and they said, no, it was Russia responded to an attack on these people. And they weren't going to allow a genocide of South Ossetia. We shouldn't use the word genocide, it's used indiscriminately. Attack and the killing of South Ossetians, and indeed what would have happened in Abkhazia. So, and then Russia. So all these so-called expansive wars turn out to be defensive. Now, this doesn't give Russia a free pass. It should have handled these things perhaps better, wider, and so on. And the same for Ukraine. So, in short, there is not a shred of evidence that Russia wants. Why does it need the Baltic republics today, when there were such troublesome neighbors when they were members of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before? Don't forget they were occupied by the Germans. It was Germanic, the Baltic republics, for hundreds of years before it fell under the Russian Empire. And of course, so I think your question is a fundamentally important one, that of course we should be defensive, and we are in a war-type situation, and it's going to get worse unless we can have dialogue and say, talk to Moscow and then say, let's de-escalate. And at the moment it's escalating. Those cables and so on you talk, it's dreadful. Instead of, you're not going to militarize your way out from this crisis. You need diplomacy. And so dialogue and diplomacy, talk to those people. There's people in Moscow waiting to talk. Not just leadership, I'm talking about this, so people I met in June, senior figures. They are people who understand they're Europeans. They want to reestablish relations with Europe, and the society wants it. So if we start talking war talk, they're going to do so. Of course they are. I've mentioned a sequence of invasions, obviously feeling, we need to build a security order in which Moscow, Warsaw, the Baltic and London all feel comfortable. That's what we failed to do after 1989, the end of the First Cold War. Hence, we've got a second Cold War. But this is going to be far more difficult to end than the first one. It's going to be very hard. And your point, therefore, is absolutely legitimate. So it's not devil's advocate. It's a very sensible one. How do we get out from this position? And we're not going to do it by spending money we don't have on arms.
One last question. In that case, thank you very much. We have coffee next door, and those going past the sea will work on us. Thank you.
So about giving long answers, but
Such a big
it is.
Can we just
Yeah,
turn
yeah.
off
You better. How do we do it?
Record.
Stop recording. Then it has to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stop recording.
Stop recording.